So if you're going to make a fireboard with a spindle, meaning that you have all your elements like the bow ready, your socket ready, and you have something to use as a spindle, this is one where this yucca was curved here at the end, so I just broke it off here. I'm going to go ahead and sharpen that. So this will also cover how to make a spindle. So you notice here that's about the size of my thumb. It's a little smaller, but that would be ideal. Especially if you're new to a bow drill, you almost want to go a little smaller. Not quite as small as a hand drill, but not as large as this. Because what that'll do for you is you'll get less resistance here, and that'll make it easier if the technique is new to you. We're going to use an Egyptian bow drill because it's my favorite. Probably one of the easiest ones to learn. It does require a little bit more cordage than the others, but in what you have to spend in cordage, it makes up for just an ease of use. So larger here, but I did create a point so that once I have a divot on this fireboard, that point will grind down over time. So when I start burning this in to indicate where I want the spindle to make the divot in the fireboard, up here at the top, this was split kind of funky. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that's all centered up. But I want less friction at the top, more friction at the bottom. Because if they're equal, then it makes it really hard to turn the spindle. Now hopefully this little piece here won't get in the way, but I want to use this, or use my resources as much as possible so I don't waste them. And I'm saving all those shavings. So I'm going to take my bow, and we'll go over bow construction here in just a little bit. And I'm going to wrap this starting from the bottom of the spindle. Notice that the thicker part's here, and I'm going to wrap this all the way up. So I'm wrapping, looks like I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for this one. That would be ideal because that's going to give me a lot more friction here to catch, so I won't get as much slippage, so there'll be less wear and tear on the cordage. Yes, you can use natural cordage, but for this lesson we're just going to use man-made cordage or modern cordage for that. So I'm going to step up here. I'm going to place that in the divot that I made. I'm going to take my socket up here at the top, which you can't see, it's kind of out of frame. So I'm going to take my socket here. This is a hardwood. And the top part of the spindle is going to go in that socket to keep it from burning my hands. So now I'm going to go ahead and put a little downward pressure, let that slowly burn in. That's going to shape the end of this spindle, and it's going to shape a little notch. Now I don't want to go too far. But just far enough to make a really good divot. You see how that has shapen the bottom part of that spindle? And it caused it to, it didn't even burn up here because there was less friction. Such a small point of contact. Now that I've got that divot in there, now you could cut, right? You could press here and cut that out with a really sharp knife. But what you got to be careful of is where are your fingers at? Because this yucca is so soft that if my finger's on the back side of that, I could potentially cut all the way through that and get myself. So if you are going to cut it, you want to put it down and press into it. So now I'm indicating where my center mark is. And it's all right if I'm a little bit off, but I want it fairly close to the center, so I'm just kind of marking it several times. And then I'm going to use a saw blade. That's the reason I like knives like this, like a Swiss Army knife. I like them to be a little bit larger than the Swiss Army knife, mainly so I can use it for chopping. The one disadvantage of this being a folding knife is that if I use this blade for chopping, it could break the knife. So I'm just getting a center cut. If you have to, you can step on it just to keep it centered. There we go. So about a quarter of the way into that notch. You don't want to go all the way to the middle. And now I'm going to make my pizza wedge here. And do that on both sides. So you don't want to make this wedge too wide, or as your spindle goes down and starts to bore deeper and deeper, it'll blow out the front. You don't want to make it too narrow, and an indication that you've gone too narrow is when you're spinning this with your bow. If your dust is just coming out here and starting to make like a little snake of dust, too narrow. And your dust is not going to stay there long enough to catch. Not saying that it won't, but it really makes you inefficient. You have to requires you to do more work. And there's a good chance, especially if you're in an area where the conditions aren't good, meaning high altitude or on the beach where there's a lot of moisture, or a combination of those two, like a cloud forest where you're at high altitude and you've got a lot of moisture in the air. It makes it really hard to get these primitive techniques to work. So you want to make sure that all of these little elements of the bow drill or any primitive fire, that you follow those. Because you might get away with it in a dry area where making a primitive fire is easy. But when you go to a more challenging area, you're going to have a problem. So now this is ready to go, and now we can start making a coal. So that's going to be the next step.